Hi, Robert. How you doing?
Good to talk to you, Thomas. We've been talking
Yes,
about doing this for a while, and now we finally have a chance to do it.
yeah, finally get a chance to talk. I'm very much looking forward to it. So, can you start just giving me a summary of your background, academic and intellectual, your biography in all respects, whatever you want to share, and what you're into?
Awesome. I'll give you sort of like the professional version first, my resume version. So it's sort of like I have a PhD in strategic management, which is a business administration discipline um,
Mm-hmm.
from University of Pittsburgh. I've also got an MBA. My undergraduate was international relations in anthropology at University of Delaware, and at that time I was working with some people who were related to world systems theory and also modern anthropology, sort of like urban and contemporary research on culture. Um, one of my mentors with that was a women's studies person, and I actually was a teaching assistant in women's studies. So you can't say too many white male hetero guys that actually got a chance
Mm-hmm.
to teach women's studies.
Yeah.
Uh, so I wanted to add that in there. But basically, I've had a complex intellectual journey. Also, my PhD minor was in organizational learning and human cognition. So I did a lot of work with people at Carnegie Mellon on what we call transactive memory systems, which is how people learn as a group. How
So,
it
is that
works
like
differently.
organizational
Yeah.
psychology or?
It's organizational behavior, right? So it's
Okay.
yeah, basically business psych. Yeah. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I had some background with that, and then I also got to do some coursework in the psych ed department, which is top 10 in the world at Pitt. I also got to take some courses in philosophy of science, and they're in the top three in the world at that, sometimes ranked number one. Um, so it was, I was exposed to a lot of elitist perspectives, let's say, from academia.
Mm-hmm.
Like cutting edge inner circle conversations and debates. And so I'm finding that a lot of the things we talked about 10 years ago are hitting the public now. Like there really is like a 10 to 20-year lag between academic conversation and public intellectual conversation. It's bigger than most people think it is, the lag. Um, so I was involved in conversations which in multiple different fields that I saw um, that resonated with me from a big sociology perspective. So
Mm-hmm.
I really like big systems. I'm a macro person much more than a micro, and
Mm-hmm.
that's where my strengths have always been. And I've seen that there's again a lag between some of the cutting edge ideas in big systems and what the public gets. Like they're not getting that information. So, for example, one of the theories that I worked with was world systems theory, um, and it's still not really hit the public. Like very few people even know what that is, and yet it was the third most important international relations theory of all time, and it was a whole perspective of the social sciences, right? So I kind of got conditioned under a world systems perspective and anthropology framework at a young age. And so I use that lens. And whenever I learn new things in new fields, I always kind of see a resonance, a callback to like what I learned back in my undergrad, you know? So that's sort of where my headspace is that I'm always looking to see how things fit into the giant picture. The very long run and very macro. Um, Although I do get involved in micro sometime. And so I have multiple publications. I've taught at 5 different universities and kind of bounced around. But we'll see where things take me in the future. I'm currently on the job market again, so I don't know where my new university home will be, but we're about to find out, so that's sort of like the professional overview of who I am and kind of where I came from. I also wanted to mention that my dissertation chair at Pittsburgh was the head of the Social Issues in Management Division of the Academy of Management. Now, I know that's a mouthful, so let me explain what that means.
Mm-hmm.
The Academy of Management is the largest business conference in the world for academics.
Mm-hmm.
So you got people from 100 countries coming to the U.S. every year for this, and it's like 25,000 people plus. Um, and there's like 25 subdivisions, and one of the most important subdivisions is social issues in management. It's technically the ethics division of the Academy of Management. So it covers business ethics, but it also covers diversity. It covers a lot of things involved with ethical issues. So they call it social issues in management instead of ethical issues.
Mm-hmm.
It's broader than just ethics. But my dissertation chair was the head of that division worldwide when I was working with him. And so all of my ideas were biased towards ethical questions. So when I was doing strategic management, I was always thinking in terms of ethical issues in business strategy. When I was doing, organizational learning, I was thinking about ethical issues in organizational learning. Everything was ethical, right? So you'll see that being a constant theme in all of my talking points is that I'm always looking for ethical dilemmas and trying to resolve them.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Do
think
you
it's a
do
pretty good summary of me in a broad brush academically.
okay? So do you want to start out with like your ethical presuppositions first, or do you want to get into just your theories on like magisteria and all that?
Let's start with Magisteria because I think this is sort of like my magnum opus. This is really what I've been building towards for 20 years, and everything else sort of fits to it like pieces of the puzzle.
Okay,
Yeah,
let's do that. Before you get into your theory, just to catch listeners up who might not be familiar with the term, can you explain what it is, and also go back to I think it's Stephen Jay Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria, just so they can have a broader context to the term, and then you can go into your ideas about it. Okay.
absolutely. Stephen Jay Gould was one of the most important and influential scientists of the 20th century, um, and usually the highest level of influence in academics is to be like the president of a large organization, such as the American Psychological Association or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you're not merely just influential as a faculty member with your own research, with your own books, but you're also just broadly influential in how the world applies or defines science. Like, so Stephen Jay Gould was the head of the National Academy of Sciences. Basically, he was. It's basically about as prestigious of a role you can get in science, and he was an anthropologist and paleontologist. And he was one of
Mm-hmm.
the people trying to define evolutionary theory and the state of it. Most people know Richard Dawkins. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so Richard Dawkins was his rival. It was based. Richard Dawkins was the, believe it or not, the underdog. So some people assume Dawkins was like the mainstream, but that's not true. The
Mm-hmm.
mainstream opinion on evolution was set by Stephen Jay Gould. So how do we interpret evolution and how does it work? And here's the debate. Stephen Jay Gould is a macroevolutionist. Um, Stephen is a micro. So he builds everything up from the cellular level of evolution. And Stephen challenged him on that and said that there's actually these emergent complex things that happen where selection occurs on the epigenetic level and on the emergent social level. But other than that, they had a lot of agreement. They were both atheists, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So Gould, in the 1980s and 90s, there was a huge debate about intelligent design versus evolution, and should we even allow intelligent design? And kind of at the height of that debate, the Pope invited Stephen to come, Jay Gould to come talk about evolution with him so that they could come to some agreement about the role of the church in moving
Hmm.
forward. Um, and he wrote this classic article, and what he said was that the church had magisteria over religious matters. That's an official term from the Catholic Church, magisteria. Um, and it comes from the Latin magister, which, even though it's been used a lot in administration all the way back to Roman times, that you could be a magistrate, for example. Um, Magister itself really means to teach, and this is not what most people imagine when they hear the word, right? So they either think of magic or they think of authority, but the real world is teaching authority. So who has the authority to teach others on a subject? Who's the authoritative source? That's what it really means. Okay. And so
Hmm.
Stephen Jay Gould says, you know what? The church has authority to teach religion. Science has the authority to teach scientific facts, empirical facts. And he summed it up as the rock of ages versus the age of rocks. He says, the church gets to be the rock of ages, whereas the science gets to know the age of rocks, right? And so what he said is that these are two different teaching magisteria. And it's very important that we understand that if Gould is at the top of this, he sets the agenda for the entire global university system because most of the world follows the US. So if he sets the agenda for the US, he also sets it for the world, right? So that means Gould's people and their perspective of evolution has magisterial authority in the scientific community. So I'll give you a similar example. Anna Freud was once the head of the APA, American Psychological Association. She was the niece of Sigmund Freud. So when she took over that role, she had magisterial authority about which lenses or theories of psychology are official and which are unofficial, and which we teach in schools and workplaces and so forth as canonical or mainstream. And of course, because she was the niece of Freud, she shifted everything as being pro-Freudian. But
Hmm.
then she had her own mistakes and she was kicked out of authority later. And there was a brief behaviorist shift where the Freudians were not welcome in the 50s and 60s. And as a reaction to them, they went into a hard behaviorist space. And the authority of science actually shifted its opinion to a different direction. So that's what we would basically call a paradigm shift. Okay, so when you're talking
Hmm.
about a paradigm shift for a magisteria, you're talking about this sort of thing. Like when Anna Freud goes in, the paradigm shift is pro-Freud, and then when Anna goes out, the American and global paradigm shift goes pro-behaviorist. Now we're pro-cognitive behavioral. And recently, we had a paradigm shift, which we would call woke psychology, which is that in every instance where there could be any controversy, we always take the most progressive interpretation, as opposed to conservative interpretations, which might say, well, biology has determined this, as opposed to you getting to determine it yourself. That's
Hmm.
so we had these periodic paradigm shifts in the world system. What is the world system? It's this overall system of how knowledge is orchestrated and produced at a macro scale and becomes globalized. And so the idea is like science is in a period where we're still in favor of Stephen Jay Gould in his definition of evolution, for example. We haven't yet fully we never fully accepted the Dawkins paradigm. It was always a secondary or minor paradigm that was fighting for dominance, but the major paradigm is still Gould's. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay.
Hmm.
So, and the idea was that when Gould wrote this letter with the Pope, was that he tried to say that he thought that when it came to science versus religion, there is a non overlap in authority. There is an overlap in reality. There is a lot of overlap in terms of the fuzziness between the border of science and religion. But what he claims is that when it comes to religious facts, only religious authorities can they have their magisterial positions. They can teach what they want to teach, and they have those authorities. He said, but when it comes to things that are empirical, science takes over, and that as this is another important thing. Um, as time goes on, more and more facts get pushed into the scientific authority and away from
Mm-hmm.
religious authority. See? So
Yeah.
in the 1500s, the Pope had tremendous power to decide what counts as a fact, including like, does the sun go around the earth or the earth around the sun?
Mm-hmm.
That's a papal authority. And when the scientific revolution occurred, there is a separation to a certain extent where they said, you know what? We're no longer let the Pope decide that set of facts. That's going to be decided by the scientists, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
as you can see, at different periods in time, there can be a relative shift in power between various authorities about what counts as facts and who gets to determine them. And so, basically, with Stephen Jay Gould, he had set the line at a certain place, but ever since he had that conversation with the Pope in the 1980s, uh, there's been a hefty, hefty push from a third source of facts, not just religion and science, but politics,
Mm-hmm.
where political authorities are saying, you know what, screw science and screw religion, we're in charge. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
now that's what's going on right now, is that what we're calling a culture war is more so a political war for prominence over science, over culture, over the economy and business. And so, as you can see, these various different institutional networks can be delineated like science, religion, culture. Well, religion, I say, is culture, really. It's the most powerful type of culture.
Mm-hmm.
So you say, and they battle for prominence and significance, not just within that space, but across spaces. And
Yeah.
right now, both the conservatives and the progressives have lost faith in science. They have lost faith in cultural authorities, such as churches, as being the power center.
Mm-hmm.
And they're trying to shift all power to political authorities, both sides. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So that's where we are as a moment in history, is that the power structures are shifting to favor politics, and it's a battle for supremacy with science. Because for the past couple hundred years, science tends to be the ultimate authority. Once science has determined that we have quantum effects, everybody else has to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
So generally, whenever we have scientific agreement and scientific progress and empirical progress, everything else has to react to that, either positively or negatively. Either they're going to say, that's great, we're going to build on it, or we're going to fight it. Well, right now you have the left wing wanting to fight science just as badly as the right, and that's not what they claim in their messaging. They try to claim that they are the side of science. But then
Mm-hmm.
we have such things as, oh, well, we're not going to determine an intersex person's Olympic status based on
Yeah. That
Paddington
was
thing. We're
completely.
going to do it politically.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, wait a minute. That is the left wing no longer siding with science anymore as the arbiter of truth. The ultimate arbiter of truth is political processes. The Olympic
Mm-hmm.
Committee said the determinant of your gender is what's on your passport. Well, what's a passport? It's a political document.
Mm-hmm.
And the meaning of the things on a passport are politically determined, and they are often determined by a ruling party which has the most influence for the longest period of time. So if you are in a progressive country, it means that your gender is determined by progressive politics. If you're in a conservative country, your gender is determined by conservative politics. and the passport just simply is the confirmation of that. So that's as non-scientific as you can possibly be about determining gender or sexuality.
Hmm.
Well, we should stop and pause and say, well, why is the progressive side no longer interested in using science as its determination? And I'm going to say that you can go through a lot of different parts of the culture wars, and you can examine that whenever the progressives seem like they're winning using science, they'll use it. But whenever it fails them, fuck science, politics is more important.
Yeah, it's,
Yeah,
it's purely opportunistic, or for the side of their argument, and they will discredit science that goes against like the premises the conclusions they already have. They just they don't want to hear that, basically.
that's right. Because if it's not useful for their victory, then they will abandon it. And what this means is that people in general, if this works on people, it means that they have abandoned science, that they don't use science for social issues as an arbiter of truth. If there's a very large percentage of people who are okay with this, then that means a very large percentage of people have abandoned empiricism. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so we have to ask ourselves, well, what are the long term consequences of that? How does that affect everything in society if science is not a social arbiter of truth? Um, this is a very new phenomenon. And the thing is that when I was in undergrad, so I started my undergrad in 1997,
Mm-hmm.
progressives were strongly committed to science being the arbiter, the final arbiter of truth at that
What do you
time.
think was that? What do you think caused that ship like to break down?
Science started invalidating some of the beliefs of the left. And so instead of rather than adapting to that, there had to be a sort of a loss of faith in science. Um, and part of that, the radicals started doing that as early as, I mean, always, let's say always. They've always been willing to, like, throw science under the bus whenever it's inconvenient. But the new left in the 1960s and 1970s came up through the humanities.
Mm-hmm.
The humanities started going to war with science on campus because
Mm-hmm.
humanities were saying, science should not bully us into how shall I say, a world that is cynical, low, not basically a status quo that they don't want to accept, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
like, if, for example, if the economic research tells us that radical welfare redistribution systems tend to collapse very quickly, um, well, that's just depressing to a far lefty. They're just like, well, just because it's never worked in the past doesn't mean it can't work in the future. So they're
Mm-hmm.
always going to say, well, whatever version of science it is that dismisses my dream ideal economic society, I'm going to have to overlook that and just simply say they didn't try hard enough, or there was internal corruption in the system that we can solve, or there's going to be new technology that's going to change it. In other words, anything that ever caused it to fail in the past can be fixed, and we can look
Yeah,
past it.
or give some reason why the study's bogus, even when it's not.
Right. So, because you could
Yeah.
basically say, I don't trust your evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, for example, recently in France, about 10, 12 years ago, this is right after the financial crisis, there was a big socialist movement, and they elected a socialist um, administration, and they pushed through some very punishing taxes for the wealthy. 70% upper tax bracket, and a a very large wealth tax, and as well as increases in capital gains and so forth. Well, what do you think happened? Any guesses what happened shortly after they pushed those taxes through?
So I have no idea. Sorry, say that part again.
So, right after the financial crisis, the French pushed through some very punishing taxes for the wealthy.
Hmm.
Okay. Any guesses what happened in reaction to that? What did the wealthy do? Did they just sit there and take it?
No, probably not.
What do you think they probably did?
Like left, did offshore accounts.
Yes,
I
they immediately moved their money out of France
yeah.
and put it into other places because it's
Mm-hmm.
so easy to do in today's world. So within a year, 25% of all millionaires who had registered as French citizens had moved abroad. One out of every four, and that was only within 12 months of the taxes being put through. Okay, and that's the ones who actually went as far as to change their residency and citizenship. The rest
Hmm.
mostly offshored anyway. It was a very
Yeah.
small percentage of the millionaires who just took it, you know. And what ended up happening was that the tax receipts slightly declined instead of increasing. There is a theory from the 1980s by a guy named Laffer called the Laffer curve. And it was one of the
Hmm.
most popular talking points of the right wing or the Republicans was that if you raise taxes, people will dodge them. And if you're bad enough, they'll find infinite ways to avoid having to pay it, even if it means
Yeah, loopholes
corruption.
and whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Even if it means going to jail for it. Okay.
Hmm.
And so the left said that's ridiculous. You're just making excuses back in the 1980s. And they said, well, until we test the theory, we don't believe you. Well, the France situation in the last dozen years was a definitive modern test of the Laffer curve. What happens when you jack the taxes up? And so the fact is, even if you are progressive in your frame of mind, you want to make the world a better place. Sometimes it just doesn't work, and scientists are supposed to evaluate that. That's our job. We're supposed to look at it and say what actually is going to work and what's going to fail. Well, politicians usually don't want to hear that.
Hmm.
Because they don't get elected on practicalities. They actually get elected on people's ideologies, not practicalities. Um, so you get where I'm saying that basically, if you, I'm an objective person. I argue this not because I have some special insight that no one else has. Not because like nobody else can do what I can do or something. It's simply because I have a commitment to objectivity and truth above my commitments to politics or any sort of ideological group. The reason
Hmm.
why is because I've seen over and over again where if you have a bias or a pre-commitment to a set of beliefs, you won't be able to look at the honest truth about whether it works.
Hmm.
So,
So,
yeah.
so can I just ask what you would propose in a situation like that instead of like raising taxes? Like, what? How do you think we can make the world a better place on like a economic front, or redistribute things in a way that doesn't seem unfair to the people that have more? Like, basically, I think we have to um, get rid of like the worst parts of our nature somehow and incentivize the good parts, but we have to do it with a good understanding of human nature and selfish interests, and not be naive and think everyone's just going to give. How do you think we can reframe culture and our institutions and our laws and policies in a way that looks out for everyone, but also keeps in mind like self-interest or meritocracy and all these important things that we don't want to get rid of?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm going to say first of all, the historical record has shown that gradualism tends to work better than
Yeah, okay.
dramatic or radical shifts in power because
Mm-hmm.
every when you do something radical, it stirs up reactionary behavior. It becomes a crisis for those who feel attacked.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're like, all right, well, I'm a millionaire. I only have $5 million. I don't have a billion. I feel attacked here. All I've got is two local cafes in prominent locations in France. But even though I have $5 million, my businesses are very volatile. And when the pandemic came along and there was a shutdown, I was almost put out of business. But people treated me the same as the billionaire, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is one of the most common problems: is that you have people who are only moderately uh, part of a power category being attacked
Mm-hmm.
with the same intensity as someone who is severely part of a power category that's skewed,
Yeah.
right? So if you just be like, well, kill all capitalists or something, you're going to take out a lot of the best people who are on your side who just happen to have more resources. Okay. So that's one thing is that you have to think about gradualism in terms of social class. That it's not just like there's the rich, there's the poor, there's the proletariat, there's the bourgeoisie, and that's all there is.
Mm-hmm.
That's just so wrong. There's dozens of different gradients of social class, and so radicals try to like simplify it. And so gradual understandings of these things is more important in policymaking. That's one. And secondly, is gradualism in terms of how much of a shift, right? Because if the shift itself is too dramatic, it's very, very messy and it's hard to plan and it lets in a lot of chaos and it's going to be a very bumpy ride. And it can often hurt people more than it helps. This is a really important one, which is like, all right, I'm also I call myself a Schumpeterian or neo-Schumpeterian when it comes to economics. Schumpeter is best known for creative destruction. The
Mm-hmm.
idea that the capitalist economy tends to be very efficient because of creative destruction, but it also has that downside of the messiness of creative destruction, like the damage caused. So, like when you
Mm-hmm.
have a brand new AI, for example, when AI comes into play, that's creative destruction. It's going to create a lot of value and a lot of opportunities, but it's going to destroy a lot of things in the process. And so, if you are too much of a free market person, you're inviting too much chaos. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it could be very bumpy, and who's going to help all those people reskill and find new jobs and all that stuff? So, a lot of economic planning can go into softening the blow, right? This is some of the most valuable policy that you can possibly have in economic intervention is to encourage innovation and growth and prosperity, but smooth out the bumps and soften the blow. So it encourages everybody to find a role in the new economy, and rather than to drop out and just sit there on the dole and just getting money for nothing, you financially encourage them to reposition themselves. And as long as they are working on repositioning themselves to be a good citizen in the new economy, then you can devote resources to helping that person. And that is a win-win that, the capitalists, the investors, they can all get behind that because they can see the value of that, where they're like, I'm not paying people to just like quit their jobs. I'm paying people to learn how to survive in the AI world, and then they're valuable, and I'm going to pay them even more, and I'm going to hire them back. And not only that, but we can give them money for entrepreneurship, so we can help them start their own businesses. Now, this is the
Mm-hmm.
type of win-win scenario where you can please all parties because everybody's getting some value out of that sort of policy. So,
Yeah. So a question I have on that is, I saw one of this is not set from my list of questions, but I saw one of your posts on transhumanism, and I think related to postmodernism versus metamodernism, and you said most metamodernists are not true metamodernist or something like that. Can you unpack your view on that, or did I misunderstand what you were saying there? But it seemed like you were very techno optimist in that case, and I'm not really a techno pessimist, but I think we need to go forward with the transhumanism idea with the precautionary principle. We don't want to just strap our brains to something and then not know the downstream consequences or what we will lose. And just presuppose that there's going to be gains and there's not dangers and risks or losing certain values. I don't think AI is inherently going to make us better. I think it has the potential to, but I think we have to weigh out where it will hinder versus where it will lead to betterment of humanity. And I think certain technologies are are obvious pros, and some are negatives, and some it's not quite clear. So could you just tell me what you meant by that in that post?
Sure. Now, there's a lot there, so I'm going to be actually answering several questions. So I'm going to start first with the neo-Schumpeterian view of the world, because it's going to help answer the question.
Oh, okay.
Because it's all about industrial revolutions, right? So, and then I'll get back to the metamodernism and where it falls into that, and the magisteria, because it all ties together, right? So let me
Okay.
just say that the big work that I'm working on is a book about seeing big history from the lens of magisteria,
Mm-hmm.
using that perspective. And it's sort of a rewrite of world systems theory, which was historically a materialist biased perspective of power, because it was built on Marxist premises originally. And when I got into it, I immediately said, well, what if we were to flip that upside down and take more of a knowledge based perspective? And when I looked at magisteria, I said, okay, that would be a knowledge based perspective, because then we're looking at how the world system is organized based on how knowledge is organized, right? And how the authority to teach and to enforce particular theories or views is what it's all about. Such as capitalism being a set of ideas, not just a material process, right? Okay. So anyway, so
Mm-hmm.
from an in order to complete that rewrite, I also wanted to look at neo-Schumpeterian economics, which is really just industrial revolutions. Okay, it's the economics of industrial revolutions, and it's a lens of looking at the macroeconomic system as a series of revolutions of technology. Okay, um,
Mm-hmm.
and so if you overlay that on top of a world systems perspective, you got a really good map. Okay, so basically, where are we in the world history, right? Well, from the neo-Schumpeterian perspective, we are at the fifth industrial revolution and bordering on the sixth. Okay, with the first one was with steam power and textiles and the original factories that tried to rationalize production in the 1700s,
Mm-hmm.
late 1700s. And so that was usually considered the first industrial revolution, because it was discovered how to efficiently scale business. Where the idea is that the digital revolution is the fifth, and it started in the 70s. Now, each revolution runs about 50 years, where a particular set of technologies are dominant for that period, and a lens, a way of looking at the entire economy through that dominant set of technologies. So since the 70s, it's been the digital, right? The internet, software, hardware, Moore's law, so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the AI revolution may be the sixth. In other words, the logic of an AI centered society is actually different than it has been for the past 50 years. Um, and there's scientific ways to justify these differences. One of them is that conventional computing and Moore's law is asymptoting towards limits of what types of problems it can solve. Where even if you just increase your processor speed 30, 40%, 100%, how many new things can you really solve with that? Well, for a
Hmm.
while, every increase in processor speed or memory power or the cost of computing opened up lots of new technology and lots of new ways for people to solve problems. You know, MP3s, MP4s. But then after a certain point, we're like, wait, when's the last time we had anything really big bang? Like we had the iPad, we had like we're running out of things to do with conventional computers at scale that we haven't already done. Well, the AI revolution is supposedly different because it takes us into a different category of problems that we can solve. And that in order for it to reach full strength, we need quantum computing because quantum computers will eventually be able to solve classes of problems that are different than what we've been working on for the past 50 years.
Hmm.
Complexity, basically, complex systems that can only be solved with extremely potent AI, extremely potent, quantum processing and things of that nature. And we're talking about fully automated transportation, such as airlines. Like, never mind air traffic controllers. We don't even need pilots. That's all going to be just integrated into one automatic system. Same thing with automated driving. So these sorts of massive scale problems work best with uh, quantum algorithms. Quantum algorithms can solve them better than conventional. And this is also true with biocomputing, like biology and biotechnology, that most biotech is limited by our ability to understand complex systems. We can't do good bioengineering, such as like what we were talking about with Neuralink and its value and so forth. We need quantum computing to solve the difficult problems there. Um, so, uh, and it's I would have to do a whole other video just to explain that, but just take my word for it for the moment that that's the consensus opinion would be if a new industrial revolution would be kicked off by our ability to solve complex problems at scale using a new generation of technology, um, which would include quantum computing and would include AI as key elements, and that they would be fundamentally different in their design than the digital stuff of the past 50 years,
Hmm.
which was all centered around serial conventional computing and conventional algorithms, right? So suppose that's where we are in history, okay?
Hmm.
Um, my claim is that the transhuman perspective becomes um, almost an imperative if the science is good enough and the technology is good enough to start solving certain problems, such as Neuralink, right? So if we have the technology to help people who are paralyzed to actually communicate with their legs again, and we don't
No,
do
I
it,
agree with that. I just want to put a separation between like using it for something to fix an ailment versus augmentation. And I'm not saying augmentation is bad. I'm just saying when we augment ourselves, we might lose something along the way that we don't want to lose, or we might, like for an example, a privacy of our thoughts or something like that, or what we cherish, what it means to be human right now, and maybe the gains outweigh whatever we lose. I'm not sure, but I just want you to be more clear on what you think the ethics of it are, or what what might be the concerns along the way, and we still have to deal with when we're talking about AGI in particular, not necessarily cybernetic systems, just the alignment problem. And I don't think putting things through a quantum computer necessarily solves that issue. It just gives it profoundly like much more information to work with, so it'll make it a million times smarter than us, which is not necessarily good if it's not aligned with our interests or whatever.
Right. So the way I'm going to answer that is I'm going to go back to the very beginning of the video and say I'm an objective social scientist. So my goal is to first be able to predict and describe and explain what is the likely outcome. After I have a prediction, then I critique it ethically. Because
Okay.
if it's unlikely, there's no point in critiquing it, right? So, for example, when we think of the worst things with nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction, for example, like some of the greatest scientists in the world tried to come up with predictions of scenarios where the world does all get destroyed, and then they wanted to make sure that they were going to prevent that, right? Because if they could make it so implausible, then they don't have to worry about it anymore. If that helps explain my point of view. Okay. So, what I'm going to say is from an is ought distinction, I think it is true that we're going to move into a transhumanist era in terms of breaking new limits in the human technical like the boundaries between the human and technology. We are going to do that. That doesn't mean it's all going to be good, but it's highly likely or going to happen, right? Now, once we start looking at the most likely things that are going to happen, then we can start critiquing which ones should we be the most worried about, if that makes any sense. So,
Okay, yeah, I agree with that.
okay, so I believe that some of the biggest concerns with artificial intelligence are focused around low probability scenarios. So, for example, the idea of Skynet, from for people who don't know what that is, from
Terminator.
Terminator
Yeah.
2, that series of movies, the idea that an all too powerful military AI suddenly decides to sort of take things over and fight humans and destroy them. And develop its own AI system, and you can think of that as almost a backstory to the Matrix. Is the idea that there had to be a moment where the machines took over. Right now, the reason why that one doesn't concern me at all is because of the system of magisteria I told you about, which is that there's too many checks and balances in that system, and too much decentralized authority for that to be a runaway scenario of any plausibility in the short term. Skynet is nearly impossible. There's no way to get there from here because of all the things you would have to be able to have power over to be able to rig it that way. Um, for example, in the United States, we have a Joint Chiefs of Staff, and we decided to create a balance of powers between various different military and intelligence departments. We have the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, the ATF, the U.S. Marshals. It's such a complex network of a balance of power that no one authority really can run the other. So think about if Skynet came out in the Air Force, the Navy has an Air Force as well. Well, that's on purpose. That way, even if the Air Force becomes dangerous, we have a second Air Force in the Navy that actually counters that. And so, no.
Presuming it's as smart or capable as the new system in order to counteract it.
Right. So, if anyone started trying to build a Skynet specifically for the Marines, it wouldn't be powerful enough to overtake the other armed forces on its own.
But
So
how
no one
do you
has the
know?
authority to even start rigging it that way. That's my point. They don't have the authority to actually give that machine the authority over enough machines. It's too divided. And even if they did, the European Union and NATO and all these other organizations also have their own counter forces to each one of these things. So there's no. If you try to think about which organization would have the best chance of building a Skynet that could have enough of power, the only one that you're really concerned about is the Russian KGB.
Yeah.
That's
Or
just
China.
about it.
I mean, China already is doing something like that, no? Like,
Um, they don't have the nuclear capabilities of Russia, uh,
hmm
which is a one of the major reasons why nobody's truly afraid of China as a World War III adversary is that they have certain limits to their power through the United Nations, where if they ever actually develop that form of power, they would be isolated like Iran. They would the rest of the world would flip. Instead of being open to trading with China, they would shut it down. And in fact, that's part of what U.S. is threatening right now, is that they're playing a staring contest with China over if China escalates, then Korea and Japan and basically almost the Australia, pretty much the entire India, all of those powers, those military powers, will all flip U.S. because they already are more U.S. aligned than they are Chinese. So if China did it, it would be as much suicide as anything. That's
no, but I'm not only talking about
yeah.
like nuclear war or destruction of the planet. Just
Oh yeah,
it,
no,
and
that was just one example. Like
I'm
so,
talking
I was
about
just giving it as an example.
totalitarianism.
Yeah.
Like just the fact that a regime could impose some sort of like AI run totalitarianism. That's more what I was talking about with China than the threat to America itself. That could be a different question.
Oh, it's already happening. So on a
Yeah.
national level, we already have China, North Korea, Russia, Iran. They're already, propaganda states of a severe nature. The U.S. is a propaganda state too, but it's not nearly as severe because of so many freedoms and checks and balances that we have. But when you have these authoritarian systems like you described, absolutely, it's already a very, very spooky situation um, because people living in those societies don't have an objective reality or access to it. And so, if that's already the case, then it's easy to use AI to abuse that power even to a greater degree. And Russian and Chinese hackers are already going to war all over the world, trying to manipulate world events. Um,
hmm
they're already doing that. So that is a very big issue, and so again, like I said, it depends on the issue in terms of the plausibility. And the simple rule, I'm trying to keep it as general as possible, like from a scientific point of view. What's the rule here? The rule is that if politics has full authority, then watch
hmm
out. And that usually happens in authoritarian regimes at a national level when the political magisteria takes control over what counts as science, how to conduct business, and what counts as appropriate culture, and it's all under control of one magisterial authority, one knowledge structure, one set of teachings at all levels. They can teach you anything they want. They can make the rules anything they want to be, and you have no recourse. That's very scary, and so yeah, that's always going to be the case. So whenever the left wing pushes too far towards that direction, I, as a conscientious objector, am going to say, look at the historical record. Um, we don't want to give them full control. Like for example, COVID. Like we don't want to give politicians full control over determining the next pandemic policy.
hmm
We want to make sure that people have cultural objections that they can actually, like the Amish, for example, that they can object. Otherwise, we
hmm
have a monoculture, and that's dangerous. because then the
Yeah.
culture becomes subject to the power of politicians.
Well, you would want cultural and scientific objections, right?
That's right. So
Yeah.
fourth, so I want to be clear. We didn't talk about the fourth, which was techno economy. So remember when I'm talking about uh, the industrial revolutions and neo Schumpeterian and all that. That's the techno economic, and that separated from politics in the 1800s. Let me
Hmm.
briefly explain that because that could be really confusing to some people if they don't know the history. But basically, the limited liability corporation was extremely important because before we developed the modern corporation, um, the only way to form a corporation in countries like the United Kingdom and early United States was you actually needed a political basically license to, that you had to individually apply for every business through an act of Parliament or Congress. So you weren't even allowed to form a company unless you could get a group of people to sign off on it as an act of Parliament in England. So, of course, almost all corporations were led or controlled by lords and well connected people. And they always got the first shot at everything because their buddies were the ones who gave them the business license. And their business license had to be in line with the government. In other words, part of that oversight was to say, is this a proper British? Are you really working for the king and crown and God and country and all that, or are you working for yourself? Well, so in the 1800s, we created a separate system of economics. It was so we had stock markets, we had insurance companies, we had accounting as a profession, um, separate from government, um, business law. All these things became separated, and limited liability companies and stock and corporations were now beholden to their investors as opposed to direct governmental over authority. Okay. And so ever since we did that, it's a separate magisteria. That what counts, what the rules of business is not the rules of politics. They fight with each other. And sometimes politicians will try to assert authority. And in authoritarian governments, they successfully do so. So the politicians take control of that magisteria again in China, for example, when they have a 5-year plan. But in liberal economies, they're separate. Okay.
Hmm.
So that means that there's all that the politicians and can only, and not just politicians, but also regulators and bureaucrats. They have certain authorities to, and they're mostly ethical. They're mostly trying to say you're not destroying the environment or you're not destroying people, human beings, or but as long as you don't offend them and you're within your legal rights, you operate under a completely different logic than the government. Okay?
Hmm.
So, as you can see, uh, in countries where you have a strong magisterial authority in the techno economy, whatever's good for business is good for everybody. The US has a very strong techno economy. So, I would argue that the US system puts techno economy first. It's in most day-to-day instances it's the strongest magisteria. If it's good for business, it's good for the rest of the United States,
Hmm.
right? And that's not true in every country. Um, and so we tend to uh, have the least amount of power in the cultural dimension in the United States, where you know why? Because you're free. Well, freedom takes all the piss out of it because if if there's only one or a few legitimate cultures in a society, like let's say Saudi Arabia, then culture has immense power. In Iran, the Ayatollah is more powerful than the government. In other words, the prime minister, who's the head of the political magisteria, is subject to the cultural,
Well, does a culture have to be oppressive for it to be powerful?
Um, so this is a very interesting question. Uh, I would say if you look at the historical evidence that when you have a lot of centralized authority, it naturally attracts oppressive elements to that hall of power,
Hmm.
because the very sort of person who would want the culture to dominate everything in the Middle East is the very sort of person who will use that power. And it becomes oppressive because it's top down. By nature, when you're constraining people's freedoms top down, it's very difficult to have that sort of accumulation of power without it being oppressive to somebody. On
Hmm.
the other extreme, we understand that if you don't have enough central power, you're too weak. You can't get anything done. So when people talk about radical decentralized societies, I'm like, guys, every time anyone ever tries that, they're immediately tread on by powerful forces. Like, why would anyone let that have power? Because, like, so for example, if you start in Spain, when they were the anarchists were threatening to have a legitimate government that really looked decentralized, the fascists immediately said, well, gee, thank you for giving us all of this productivity and technology that we can just take over with a gun. We're just going to walk right up to you, put a gun to your head, and said thank you, but we're in charge of it now. Which is exactly what happened in fascist Spain. The anarchists were off to the races, making really nice, peaceful things, and then they just came with guns and said, "We'll take that. Thank you very much." So this is the reason why we always have this delicate balance between freedom and power, and that if we're too cavalier about being decentralized and fair and free and open, the bullies will exploit us. On the other hand, we can become the bullies ourselves. And this is part of the danger of being a progressive that likes federal power, is that you're basically saying, well, let's just bully whoever our enemies are instead of.
Or cultural power too, right? Like
Exactly.
you see that with cancel culture and how they try to like minimize it or pretend it's a good or doesn't exist or whatever the case, whatever they're trying to say in order to justify the thing they're upholding. But it's really toxic for freedom and for figuring stuff out and just having a reason and empathy and compassion. It's completely destructive.
That's right. So basically, it's self defeating in an ethical perspective. If all you care about is putting people into positions of power, um, it has some efficacy. I mean, DEI and cancel culture has shifted power a little bit. You have more people in the past 10 years who are Black women or trans or so forth, who have been placed into positions of authority, but those placements have been very hasty, meaning that we haven't yet determined that they knew they had a plan, that they knew when they were
Zero plan.
right, that they were thrust into that situation unprepared because they had never expected it to work. So next thing you know, we have Claudine Gay as president of Harvard, which was an unexpected thing for most people. But Harvard said, you know what, we're going full on woke. We're going to do everything we can immediately to put people into power positions that will signal that we're diverse and inclusive. And then they're going to repeat that. We're going to give them the power to like keep replicating that, but they didn't have a plan yet about how to actually execute it. So when they got there, A very large percentage of people in power who were empowered by DEI said that within a year or two, they ran up against the same bureaucratic impossibilities as the white guy who was in the same role. So they used to
Hmm.
say it's just because you were a white guy. If we had a black woman making that decision, it wouldn't be a problem. It's just the fact that the white guy was in that seat of power. Once we put the black woman in there, all things will be fixed. So then you put a black woman in that situation, she immediately says, "Oh my goodness, no wonder we can't do that. There's all these obstructions and limitations and regulations and bureaucratic complexities. And I can't just, use nepotistic power to just insert black faces everywhere I want to. It doesn't work that way." And so they run into that situation and they realize how difficult it is to actually enforce DEI policy and to even create DEI policy because some of it violates law, some of it doesn't work. And so then they throw a tantrum and they get upset, and then they either quit or they get forced out, and then we're back to where we started. And that's what's been going on in the past 2 years, is that there's been a whole lot of canceling of the DEI people, where after they won their victories, they themselves got canceled. Most major tech companies are firing their DEI departments.
Well, usually I would consider cancellation coming from the DEI woke source, not um, them being removed. Because when they're removed, I think it's a response to them pushing themselves in a power position they should never be in the first place. Is that the same thing as cancel culture?
Well, let's be clear, because cancel culture can sometimes be biased. In other words, the analysis of it, where we don't want to get it caught into the loop where if we're critiquing left wingers, that we wouldn't use the same criteria with right wingers, right?
No, no, I'm not
No,
saying
I'm
that.
not saying you did. I'm not saying you did.
Yeah.
I'm just saying I'm setting up what I'm about to say.
Hmm.
Okay. So I'm saying that let's be really careful here. And I'm going to use the language of cancellation slightly different than it usually is used.
Okay.
Okay. Uh,
Can you define it how you're using it though, so that I'm clear?
yes.
Okay.
So let's define cancellation in my language. My language is it is the court of opinion where either the public or people in positions of authority to make decisions deem a person unethical, okay, and therefore bad to promote either publicly or to promote as an authority, right? So it's an
Hmm.
ethical judgment, and it's done before the law. So we didn't actually take a person to court to make this change. We did it before that. So maybe there was a court proceeding that's going to happen, but that's irrelevant. All that matters is we already decided they're unethical. We're going to remove them from power. That's cancellation. So they didn't actually get their day in court yet. Okay. So
Hmm.
that's a very objective way to define it. So if say a conservative was being accused of being affiliated with neo Nazis, but there was no formal process where we actually established that with the magisterial authority. Remember, I'm using the magisterial perspective. We didn't actually. No one with formal authority would ever proved anything. Okay. Um, we made a prejudgment and immediately acted on that prejudgment to avoid blowback or a bigger to do, right? So,
Hmm.
if people who are conservatives are then often canceled, like I'll give you an example. A big cancellation event was Scott Adams,
Hmm.
okay, where he was one of the most powerful podcasters, and he had a center to center right position.
Hmm.
Um, he may not have saw himself as center right, but by today's standards, he is. Um, but basically, he made a couple of comments just in conjecture, just in debate that offended people, implying, oh, maybe, some sort of racial bias, or about, he was talking about people wanting to live in black neighborhoods and why they might not want to, or something of that nature. And the implication was, well, he's a genuine racist. He genuine thinks all black people, blah, 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 blah. And he was like, I was conjecturing. It was in the context of a hypothetical, right? And it's not
Hmm.
a hypothetical he subscribed to. And if you were a loyal follower of Scott Adams, he put out hundreds of hypotheticals. That was what he did as a teacher. He put out hypotheticals and let people debate through them. In order to do that, you have to sometimes pose hypotheticals that are unpleasant, or things that you might not agree with, but we need to face them. Well, he got
Hmm.
accused a priori that he actually was promoting those hypotheticals rather than just posing them. Okay. He lost his syndication, millions of dollars of income, because of that hypothetical. That is a cancel culture activity. Now let's go over to Claudine Gay. Claudine Gay got canceled because we never had proven that Claudine had any intent, malicious intent, to be say a serial fraud in academia. It could have entirely be that her training didn't stress the type of meticulousness that we wanted of her in citing appropriately. And it turns out that the DEI crowd are all being trained that way. They're not being trained to the same standards of citation as, say, history scholars or the people I work with in business, where you have to very, very carefully cite and vet all of your sources and all that. Well, if you look at DEI going back decades, they've had very soft rules about how you justify facts or cite authorities, or, you know, and if everybody's doing it and you're just a product of that environment, are you really trying to do harm? Or is it just something that you could learn from, like a learning moment? Just think about when we say white people have a learning moments where they learn from minorities about where they're just not, you know, getting it. And so this is a learning moment. We're not going to persecute you. You're going to learn how things work, and we'll give you a few chances or whatever. Well, the Claudine Gay incident could have been a learning moment, or it could have been a persecution. And my claim is that even though I do believe she was in the wrong academically, I don't actually think she was malicious. I think she needed a learning moment. But
No, I
because
don't
of
think she
how
was.
because
Go
of
ahead.
how politically intense it was, she decided to step down rather than, take credit for making that mistake. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, some of the learning moments, especially when it pertains to race and gender issues, can sometimes have a layer of like condescension, though, and I don't know how honest they are. But for this example, let's say there could be a learning moment. I think she wasn't actually uh, canceled for that. That was a justification for the fact that she did not stand up to the vile protesters that were saying anti-Semitic things, and then they found some more tangible justification to say why she shouldn't be in that position, and they used it, and that might be unfair. But I think she wasn't actually can because that was always out there. It's just nobody ever investigated it, right? I think she was like I think they were trying to give uh, the DEI folks a taste of their own medicine. Not whether it's right or not might is an open question, but basically cancel her for upholding this kind of cancel culture and it, being the type of person that or of the group that is is generally doing the cancellations for very insignificant, non-criminal, taboo kind of offenses of just not um, expressing the right opinion, or saying an unpopular thing or something that sounds too edgy.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Um,
she was canceled for the same reasons that she was the attacker. That's so. Um, where I'm slightly disagreeing with you, just slightly, is I'm saying that she absolutely did things to offend people, and the Jewish student body was offended. Um, However, she was promoted on the basis that she was ideologically aligned with a lot of people in power at the university, not on the basis that she was a total rebel, right? It was There was a paradigm shift at Harvard. Speaking of authority and paradigm shifts, Harvard went through a long period where they said our job is to create the leaders of the world, and they have to be the best educated, and they have to have access to objective points of view and objective facts to do that. Um, well, what happened is in the last 10 years, Harvard and many other left leaning universities have abandoned that objectivity, and they have focused almost entirely on whether or not that leadership is in promotion of social justice or the correct values. So you're absolutely right. This has been a challenge of as we started with, the objectivity of science led into all this. And so Claudine, we know, is not an objective scientist. She is a social justice oriented scientist, as you and I were talking about earlier. So obviously, if you're someone like me, my point of view is, yeah, I don't want that in charge of Harvard, because that challenges the independence of
yeah.
science and its authority. On the other hand, to be fair, the way she was taken down was also not officially scientific, is what I'm saying. It's one political opinion against another, or one cultural opinion against another, but it certainly was not scientific. The way she got the job and the way she lost the job in both cases was a court of public opinion more than it was an official, authoritative, scientific, empirical sort of way to do it.
So, what do you think a better way to do it would have been? Because presumably, any committee hearing at Harvard would likely share her ideological bias to some extent, or at least have deep sympathies for it, because the optics of it look good on the university, or at least did up until that moment. So, what do you think can be done in a case like that? Or am I just wrong for assuming that? I could be entirely wrong. You can push back and say no, I don't think you're right about that. But um,
So, as I said, is versus ought, right? So, if you ask me about my prediction is that, of course, we see this sort of thing, and we're going to see a lot more of it, because of the very nature of academic governance in the world today, is that we won't let science have the final word. That the way we govern academics, not just at the university level, but the Academy of Sciences, all these major academic organizations, they have all decided recently that the political issues are more important than objectivity. And so I would predict that we're going to see more of that until we have a major reckoning. And that major reckoning is, like I said, from a creative destruction perspective, could be pretty bumpy. It could be a revolution that's unpleasant. And for example, AI may start being able to predict the biases and the outcomes of these sorts of scenarios, right? Like, we could actually develop an AI that'll say, well, chances are you're going to do this, and then this is going to happen, and it's going to, You can actually have AI surveillance that studies. So whenever you have an applicant to the presidency of Harvard, an AI will vet the person, and the AI would have already checked for plagiarism and all this other stuff before they ever had a chance. So my belief is that's what we're going to see. Is that we're going to see we're going to turn things over to AI because we don't have the time, the budget, and the will to say perfectly vet everybody. We're just say, well, AI is going to vet the next Claudine Gay, right? And AI is going to determine both whether or not this person is who they say they are, whether or not they've been following all the rules, but also whether or not they're going to, based on their pattern of speech and their recent writings and so forth, will they uphold our values? Is that good or bad? I mean, well, as you can see, it can immediately become just as bad as it is good, depending on who's in charge of it. So as long as you have scientists who are objective, who are in charge of the vetting process, you're going to have a little more confidence. But if you let politically minded people control the AI who vet the politically minded people, then it's going to put it on steroids.
Yeah, but what do you do when so many scientists, or at least some subset of them, have been infected with political ideas?
War. If you look at history for thousands of years, when we reach an impasse, especially politically, it is usually resolved by outright war because unfortunately nobody has the authority to be the adult and to say, here's how we're going to resolve this without war. We try over and over again. This is what goes on in Israel and Palestine, by the way. Um, Again, this is a fun one. I don't want to spend much time on it because it's a whole topic of its own. But suffice it to
Mhm.
say that every time outside interventions have occurred, the United Nations, the United States, no matter what authority comes in and says, let's resolve this objectively, they have found that neither side was willing to submit to an objective process. I had a faculty member at University of Pittsburgh who I got to meet before he retired. His name was Tom Sadie, and he was a world expert in decision sciences. He was one of the founders of it as a modern field. And the idea of
Like decision theory, right?
yeah, well, the idea of decision sciences in general is can we use algorithms, machines, processes, whatever, to make good decisions? And what are those algorithms? What do those decision algorithms look like? These are alternatives to democracy. Is really what decision sciences are. There are the idea is what are problem solving heuristics that are alternatives to democracy. And so, what Tom Sadie did is he tried to come up with what he called as a hierarchical decision process, which mathematically would force the most objective outcome as long as everyone committed to it. So you could put in all of your priorities, all of your opinions. Everybody could put that in there. The Palestinians could say,
By
here's what we
objective,
want.
by objective, do you mean fair also in there, or no? Because we're talking about outcomes and how they affect people. Are you smuggling fair in there as well, or no?
I was talking about goals.
Okay.
So let's say the Palestinians have a goal of trying to stabilize their economy, and they have another goal of they want water. Um, you know, they have a list of things that are important to them, and those are their goals. And then the Israelis have a list of things that are important to them. If you have a really good objective process and everybody's willing to submit themselves to it, you could negotiate a solution. But so Tom Sadie worked with the UN and several different organizations to try to create the most objective negotiation system they could. And every time they attempted to do it, one side or the other pulled out before the final decision, where they basically said, "I'm sorry, but we can't submit to this as the final authority." Like
Mhm.
the reason why was because of the power of their leadership, their politicians, who basically said, in all honesty, we don't want to solve this, at least not this way, because we would lose power. We actually have more power from it being a broken system than a fixed one. And
Mm-hmm.
so the real truth of Israel versus Palestine is that neither side has been willing to give up their power in order to have the citizens of both sides live a better outcome. The power, the decision makers care more about their power than actually resolving anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's
And I
why
can
politics is so
go
fatally
ahead.
flawed.
You cut out there. I couldn't hear you. Say
I
again.
said that's why politics is so fatally flawed.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way political decision making works is that power is usually more important than the solution.
But do you think AI can really like fix like I agree that we need to have some kind of post democracy system, but don't you think, like, if you do it through tech, you can have like a techno autocracy of some kind, and then it can be misaligned or programmed wrong, or somebody can take hold of it or capture it in some way, and then like that's what I'm worried about with tech. Not that I think tech is bad. Obviously, I think when you're talking about like uh, driverless cars. I think that's obviously saved so many lives. You can't really argue against it, or you're talking about certain things. But when you're talking about like, implanting things in the brain or giving control to an AI over governance, I think it gets a little bit more complicated because I don't know. It doesn't have that human feel. I mean, we can try to program it in. Anyway, I'll let you respond to that.
So, what do you think Sam Altman says in response to that, or Elon Musk? Well, they said OpenAI is going to be a sort of nonprofit with its own goals and its own interests, and it's not going to be run by the government, and it's not going to be run by business, and it's going to be this separate thing, right? And the only way you can create ethical AI is to make sure that it's not controlled by these various biased powers. Now, as you and I have discussed, well, if you're not one of the major magisteria, then the world system hasn't really given you that kind of power yet. You don't have that official power. So at the United Nations, you've got all the major nations that are vetted there. So political magisteria is aligned by these sorts of international bodies. They have, everybody recognizes nation states as being very powerful. Same thing with multinational corporations. They are, it's a well-defined space. Their powers are well-defined or whatever. But when you get into nonprofits, sometimes you get very weak power. And this is one of the things that nonprofits have been struggling with for a long time is they're like, well, we neither have true political authority nor true business authority because we're not playing by either one of those rules. And so they tend to be weak organizations. So one of the solutions to this is to create a new magisteria, which means something that has the kind of power that it can be a check and balance to culture, politics, techno economy, and science. So that I don't think they're enough. I think we need basically a magisteria of the commons, and it has to have certain powers. And just like in the 1700s, when we had this revolution in democracy, we need a revolution in commons based authority, right? And let me explain that briefly because it's pretty hard for us. It's as hard for us to understand that now as it was for people prior to science to understand science as a separate authority, right? From
Mhm.
the church and the state. Because until like the 1500s, all we had was church and state. Anything else was of lesser power, right? So,
Yeah.
so we had politics and culture, and that was it. And then we added science after the scientific revolution, and then we added techno economy after the industrial revolution, which is focused around like I said, businesses that are for profit. So what we have is this huge nonprofit economy of problem solving with very little power if it's separable from government. And that needs to change. Those things need to be elevated in power, and they need to be given as express powers over certain things that we can't trust to the other four, right? One of those is environmental solutions. That uh, there's many people who have discussed this, but we need bioregional power. We need to be able to say that the desert environments of the world work together to handle desert ecology, and people who live in tundra environments handle the tundra ecology, and people who live in rainforest handle rainforest ecology, and that there be some sort of separate authority where those peoples can say, we cannot cross a certain line. There's only so much of deforestation we can permit because it will cause environmental collapse. There's only so much pollution we can permit, and so on and so forth. So that would be a magisterial authority over the environment. The reason why is because we're at or beyond planetary capacity for being able to support human population as well as the rest of ecology. Something has to give. Either people have to die or the ecology needs to die, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea is that a magisterial authority will force other authorities to try to resolve that problem within limits. So think about that. So then on the digital side, we have certain types of digital problems that are global and affect everybody. One of them is obviously trying to show truth in media, like what's really true, as opposed to what is a political position or merely a perspective as opposed to a vetted fact. Um, AI can help with that. Then you have basically our digital identities. Do we really trust them to a government or to a business? Should Google determine our digital identity? Should the United States determine it? Or should we have a globally impartial system that determines our identity as a global citizen? Right? So my claim is that most of these really hairy ethical problems related to AI need to be done within a separate digital commons framework. And what I mean by digital commons is that we are global citizens of a digital commons, and that we therefore have our interests globally on that particular perspective, and we can't trust those other magisteria. Even science can't be trusted. And the reason why,
But how can we trust the AI magisteria though? Like how do we know when we can trust it is my question. Sorry if I'm being pedantic or asking the same thing over and over. I just want to get to the crux of what it means for the system to actually be functioning the way we want for our best interest versus not.
okay, so I will say that I don't believe any one person in the year 2024 has that fully figured out yet. It's something that we need to be working on. I don't think it's resolved. It's a lively debate. However, I do think we know a few things, right? And I can speak to the things that we do know or the things that I have confidence in supporting. The first one is that we need to take, we need to let science help launch the digital and environmental magisteria, okay? Because we can't trust anybody else to kick it off. If anybody else is at the center of it, it'll be biased in a fatally flawed ways. So some people wanted to give, like, I'll give you an example. Some people wanted to give authority to indigenous groups to say, well, if you are an indigenous group who still lives in the rainforest, you get to make all the decisions. One of the counter arguments to that is that they don't actually have enough knowledge or stake in the overall global ecology. In other words, it sounds like a good idea, but they're going to bias it towards their local cultural interest against the rest of the world. And to be honest, if we think about them as citizens in a global landscape, that's not good enough anymore because their decisions locally can impact the whole world if they live in the rainforest. So we have to meet with them halfway. We can't just simply say their tribe gets to run this. We have, you see what I'm saying? Okay, so
No, I agree with that.
so
I'm
I'm gonna
all for like.
yeah, I'm gonna take
Go ahead.
sorry, I'm going to take that into AI now, right? So who do we actually trust to super to make decisions over how to use AI and the guardrails on it? And we can't just simply give it to people who have the greatest historical interest in it, just like in the rainforest scenario, right? So we know what we shouldn't do. And one of the things we can't do is turn AI over to the military. They have the greatest interest in it, just like indigenous people do in the rainforest. That doesn't mean we can actually trust them, right? So the very first principle is it has to be peaceful. And that means that any armed authority, police, military, whatever, they actually need to gain access to it. Does that make sense? That like so like I said, I don't have a complete answer, but I can give you some principles. The military currently is trying to be in the lead, like the NSA in the United States, National Security Agency.
Mhm.
Um, they got to AI first, and they got to AI first because they want to control coded communications, the ability to code and decode for security, and it's super important. However, we have to start questioning whether or not we should really let them actually control the tools. That they would have to access them rather than own them themselves. So here's where I would go with a Sam Altman, and I'd say, if we can force the military to use the AI, that's great. I'll give you another example of this: the World Wide Web. The military originally controlled the internet. And in every country, every sort of internet was controlled by their own military. But it started with DARPA in the United States. But what we had was the Electronic Frontier Foundation and several other organizations to say, you know what, Tim Berners Lee has created a worldwide open system for the internet called the World Wide Web. And he did it working at CERN, science. See, there you go. So he spun off from science. He worked with scientists to try to create a more objective web, right? Then spun it off, put it into the public domain, and created a council called the W3C community. Have you ever heard of this?
No, not specifically. No, not WC. No, I have not.
W3C. So they're the people who actually run the World Wide Web.
Okay.
W3, World Wide Web.
Okay.
W3C
Yeah.
community. Okay. They're the ones
Okay.
who actually run the global standards for the internet. And it is an open community. Anybody, you and I, can walk in to any meeting. That doesn't mean we have ultimate decision power, but all our voices can be heard. It's entirely a volunteer structure, and the people who have been running it vet each other as being this not putting any other interest ahead of the interest of the community itself. So they're not like active members of the FBI or something, right? But they also talk to government organizations. They talk to the world's most powerful businesses, and they invite them to help individual problems. So the WC3 community, for example, will work on a particular technology standard, and then they will invite Google and other people to help them make sure it works. Okay, but they are their own standard, and they are a commons-led organization where basically it's based on donation and volunteer effort.
Mhm.
And believe it or not, the World Wide Web works, and it has been running well because of that. Prior to that, when it was run by militaries, it was obstructed and it moved slower than you would imagine. It wasn't until we set it free that it exploded and took over the world. So, if we already have
Yes.
that as an example, then we need to understand it may not be perfect, but it's the best we got. So, if we repeat that pattern with AI the same way we did with the World Wide Web, we are in a better scenario than if we simply give power to certain organizations to take it over. And
I agree that we're in a better situation if we do it that way. But can the same really be applied to some? Can we have the same level of control or security over a thing that is much smarter than we have to I just think we have to be extremely cautious with especially when we're talking about cybernetic systems, like mixing it with biology. I'm not so concerned about like external AI compute. I think there is a concern with that too, but I'm mostly concerned with the Neuralink stuff, because I think like how do we know if we just like it takes control of our brain and starts making decisions for us, and people from the outside think it's us making decisions? How do we know if it turns us into pea zombies and then we're not actually conscious anymore and it's actually running some I know these. There's probably some neuroscientific answer that we can figure all that out, but I just think it's very very scary stuff. I'm less scared of like CRISPR and genetic engineering, although there's some ethical concerns there. But I'm mostly concerned of jumping on the AI bandwagon, and even with things like ChatGPT, I'm worried about like we have to watermark these things, like basically pulling from Dan Dennett's idea of like counterfeit humans. Like if we make a bunch of counterfeit humans and we don't know if we're talking to a human or AI anymore, once we cross that bridge, like that could be a danger zone. And I don't think we've established enough of a digital commons yet to say, hey, we're just gonna figure it out. I think we have to figure out the digital commons before we implement certain things, not after we and play catch up, because we might not catch up.
I agree.
Like, are you not concerned about that?
So, first of all, I agree. And second of all, I'm going to reassure you that we are actually doing that. Now, it's not perfect. Like, whenever a new technology is introduced to the world, especially at the level of an industrial revolution, it's always a bumpy ride. And that means there's some volatility, and especially ethical volatility, where mistakes are made. Absolutely. It's always happened. And we're holding ourselves globally to a much higher standard than we ever did in the past. And we should, because we can destroy the whole world now, which we couldn't, right? But if you look at it in prior industrial revolutions, there's always like these big crazes and financial bubbles and casino capitalism and so forth. It's
Mm-hmm.
part of the techno-economic system that we allow speculation, and we allow gross over speculation that can often be very dangerous. And so like when the every single industrial revolution began with a boom, like the railroads. So what happened was that everybody speculated like crazy. Made a huge financial bubble that burst, and then we learn from our mistakes. When we go the dot coms, for example, if you remember the dot com bubble. So we're going to expect something similar with AI, because that's just sort of how that system works. Um, but what I can say is that the technology that reaches the market has already been nerfed. If you know what I mean by nerf, video gamers, for people who don't know what it means, if they're going to watch this, when you nerf something, it's like a real football versus a nerf football, or a real gun versus a nerf gun. It's you took all the real power out of it, so it's not as harmful. And so we nerf the technology before it reaches the general market. The reason why is because whenever it's
Or we think we do.
well, we definitely do.
Yeah.
There are It's not foolproof though. It's never foolproof. So let me
Yeah.
just like we're not perfect at doing so. So
Yeah.
for example, uh, in order for CRISPR to hit the market, so there's much more powerful gene editing tools in government labs. You have to have security clearance to even have access to them,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the government is already ahead of the rest of us in identifying this stuff 20, 30 years in advance, because they've already been working at it at that level before the public even knows about it. I'll give you an example there. Virtual reality was being used by the military in the 1970s for flight training 20 years before
Mhm.
anyone in the private sector had access to the same technology for the same purpose. Um, why? Because it was an order of magnitude more expensive, and only the government could justify that, and they could only do so by having military advantage. So the military gets to everything first. Just be assured of that, because that's how they work. And then what they try to do is say, well, this is what is sensitive and we need to control. And then this is what we're going to let out into the techno economy for private business to be able to openly compete on and whatever. And it's never perfect. Bitcoin is an example of a leak. The government never intended for that to be leaked. Um,
Mhm.
that sort of technology was already being worked on for government purposes. And when it was leaked, they had to decide: do we just kill this guy and just make it all disappear, and do really nasty clandestine operations, or do we just say, well, it's not worth fighting, or we should give up? We can't wage war over this one. So there are leaks all the time, and in AI, there's going to be leaks, right? And so you and I are concerned about that, right? But we should know that most of it's been nerfed, and that means the legal AI, that which businesses are allowed to use, um, is stated, and that means in the European Union and the United States, if you start dabbling into certain types of power, you will get a visit from the NSA. They will show up and say you can't do that. It's Apple has, for example, Apple has had multiple situations where it has to work with the government to be allowed to do what Apple does in terms of data management. The
Mhm.
government sets rules and says, no, you can't control people's identity like that, or you can't do this, or you can't do that. Um, I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm saying that most of the worst case scenarios have been ruled out for now. For now. The worst case scenarios. That doesn't
Mhm.
mean bad shit isn't going to happen. But the
Mhm.
odds of somebody creating a technology using Neuralink that's going to turn you into a zombie that is remotely controlled is extremely low, because we already have laws against that. Um, they're not generally known because these are laws that are more, they have to do with national security. They're more military law than they are, public law. And a military power can intervene and say you're not allowed to do that. That's military grade weaponry. It's basically
No, I'm also talking about like incidentally though, like incompetence, not corruption or as somebody with like an evil plan. I'm just saying like we miscalibrate something with the tech, and the tech is doing something other than it should be doing, or there's some kind of glitch in it,
yeah,
and then
that will
yeah,
happen. We will deal with that. There is going to be a lot of ugly glitches and volatility and noise. So don't get me wrong, bad things are going to happen. Absolutely. But usually what happens when it comes to techno economy, at least historically, is we just accept that volatility, like we accept stock market bubbles and bursts, and millions of people get hurt, and million bad things happen, but we still let it happen. Now, if you're on the left, you don't want that to happen, right? Like, as going back to the beginning of the conversation, if you're far enough left, you don't want any bad things to happen with AI. You want to get ahead of it. You want to use your particular ideology and your authority to make sure that the world is shaped into your image. Of course, what if it's the wrong left? You know, as you and I pointed out, look at
yeah.
China.
I could see a conservative version of that caution though. It doesn't inherently have to be a left wing caution.
Oh no, far right could be even more dangerous. um,
Yeah.
but my point is the only that the economy, like when we allow businesses to freely innovate, uh, there's always a risk that in that space there's going to be too much experimentation, speculation, and some bad actors. So if you give people personal computers, they might find a way to use them bad ways. So, for example, the internet child pornographers, horrible people. How do you prevent them from doing that in advance? Well, they just build another dark web, and then they just, so we're always fighting a war it's always a race against the psychopath. Okay, no matter what we're doing. And you're
Hmm.
absolutely right that if when you release powerful technology, it just makes the psychopaths even more powerful, as well as the people trying to do good. That's always the case. My simple answer for you is that if you have dedicated groups of people who say we want to be the heroes, we want to fight the bad guys, um, they eventually win. They in history we've never had a scenario where the bad guys won. Ultimately, in the very long run, they tend to win in the short run because they're willing to move fast and do terrible things, and so they can operate with haste. Um, the good guys usually are encumbered by the rules, and it takes us longer to get around to doing things to solve it. But I'm just going to basically argue that's the stuff of life. The spice of life is that there is drama and that there is a war between the good guys and the bad guys. And so I don't want to ever completely end that. I don't ever want to have a world where there's not a single bad guy left or a single risk left where, if we've taken out
No,
all
I
risk.
don't think that's even possible. Even if it were desirable, and I don't know if it is.
No, I
I
don't
don't
think it
think
is
it is. But
possible.
yeah, yeah.
But what we do need to do, like you were saying, Thomas, is we need to be proactive in saying what's the best that we can do without taking away. With risk comes reward. And when we take away the risk, we lower the rewards. This is the general rule of the techno economy, the business sphere of the world, is that if you want a low risk economy, stop innovating. Just make it all illegal. Just we're not going to have any new technology. We're done. That's what the Amish kind of did, right? They're like, we don't want to keep introducing new evils to the world, so we're just not going to allow it.
No, I'm not arguing for
Yeah,
some like neo-Luddism or
right.
anarcho-primitivism. I'm not arguing that.
No,
I'm arguing for like a a caution, like basically like just be cautious going forward, and there are some truths in, let's say, anarcho-primitivism, and some truths in techno-optimism, and we need to find the synthesis between those and find, like, okay, what's good about being human and not changing ourselves, and what do we desperately need to change, what would actually lead to the betterment, and find like a way forward that isn't based on like old concepts or systems, but can kind of mix them and birth a new idea or a new system
agreed.
of thinking.
And my punchline on that was simply the next step is to establish a separate magisterial authority on that, which
And you would call that the digital commons, or would that be like a separate magisteria from that one?
it may end up having a different name to it, but for right now, I'm referring it to
Yeah.
as the digital commons. And
Okay.
the digital commons is basically going to be a system of digital authorities over universal digital challenges, and those include governance of the World Wide Web as one of the actors in that magisteria. You also have the AI governance boards. You're going to have, most importantly, digital identity, which is a massive worldwide problem. Um, and most of the solutions are kind of scary. That pretty much most of the things that do work are, it's like once you go there, you can't really go back. Like if we use Sam Altman's solution of retinal scanning everybody on the planet and putting it on the blockchain, uh, I mean, there's some very strong upsides to that, and there's some very strong downsides. So
Yeah.
that's what we're going to be dealing with over the next couple of decades. My belief is we're watching the emergence of a separate set of authorities, and one of the first ones was the World Wide Web, the W3C community, and they're kind of like the template for it. But we're going to see a series of these authorities, and they're going to take over most of these problems. However, it's going to be a rough ride, and we can't fully trust them. We've got to keep our eye on them. And every other authority needs to. Basically, the idea is that if you're a government, if you're a business, or even if you're some sort of cultural organization, you've got to request information through that separate system, which means I don't get to own your identity as a business. That if I want access to your identity, I need to gain access by requesting that information through the digital authority, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That way, there you can't have a business build up a lot of spyware or malware or like manipulative things that they're doing behind closed doors with your identity. There's so many things that Google could do to you if they wanted to, and Apple, whatever, to prevent that sort of malicious behavior. We just simply take your identity from them, so they don't actually own it on their servers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the best ideas that I've heard about this is to start from the smart city level, so that if you're a resident of a city, your global citizenship information is mirrored at a city level. So the idea is that you are always going to be. So when you live in a smart city, anything in that city that wants access to your data, like suppose it's mass transit or local health authorities, anything that wants your access, there is a local city level verification of your identity. And if you change cities, it moves with you. So that you manage it at the city level, and then you have a mirror of that at the international level.
Mm-hmm.
They have to sort of like be a check and balance. Like you get checked on both levels. So that also means like if you are an immigrant and you come to a new city and you go to a new country, or you need to establish an identity. You do it at the city level, and then they kind of check that or mirror that at the international level. If that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
So you have those two levels, and for the environment, it's going to be at the bioregional level, which is if you're a citizen of a bioregion, you have a stake in the bioregion, or if you are a international organization, an organization with power that spans localities, that's a separate question. So a multinational corporation, for example, that operates in 40 different countries, if they have a stake in the environment, that's an international level. And then there's the bioregional level. So the idea is that if you start establishing data and powers for ethical checks and balances at these levels, yes, it does make the world more complicated. But if we're introducing such things as AI, it becomes much easier to manage.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want AI to start there. I want the most important AI systems and structures to be based around the environment and the digital commons, and for that to be the standard. Now, if we don't do that, the ethical risks are sky high. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so my way of concluding it with you is to say if we're not heading that direction, if we instead give it to politicians or we give it to the military and we let them decide, or we give it to businesses, everything that you said, we're at great risk. I mean, it's one of the most risky technologies in world history. And we can't simply trust it to biased authorities, because they could rig elections, they could make you, they could ruin your life, they could cancel you, they could do all these sorts of things, anything they want to do that's malicious if you don't have a higher ethical authority.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question on a different topic, more culture war related, because uh, we seem to be both like moderates and based on like logic, empiricism, like and I think compassion too, and wanting the world to be a better place. How do we bring conversation back? Not that the answer is always in the middle, because sometimes radical answers can be correct, but on average, in the aggregate, probably somewhere in the middle. How do we bring culture back into the middle and being able to use reason and not jumping on ideological bandwagons, whether it's a left wing or right wing position. How I've heard you talk about this in some of your videos, but if you could expand a little bit on that, that'd be nice.
Sure.
And then we can,
Sure.
yeah.
So let me explain where it went off the rails, and then we can discuss how we could get it back on the rails.
Okay.
So going back to my magisterial model, if you look at the evolutionary theory, it was a severe blow to the authority of religion in the world system. And when I say the authority of religion, I don't mean this is my personal opinion. I mean in international law, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how many different countries or international scenarios would you actually let religious fact determine truth or the outcome? That greatly diminished, because even in the early 20th century we were still kind of a Christian nation, but every decade since evolutionary theory we've moved further and further away from letting cultural authorities have any real power. Like, it's mostly symbolic. So the more cultural freedom, the less power we actually have in culture. And so where do we pick up the slack? Well, politics. So when religion has been nerfed, it's more symbolic than genuinely official in most countries now. Although in the Middle East it's still powerful, but you have a power vacuum, and you have Marxism, which basically said, the new religion is the state, and in the future, the Marxists wanted it to be the Communist Party, and that meant that it had totalitarian control over both politics and culture, so that there's no difference. So if you're far enough left, since Karl Marx, then you believe in a unity of culture and politics. And this is where all the danger comes into play. Okay? Because then if cultural authority and political authority are entirely merged and into a single party system, then there's no checks and balances. And so a lot of radicals think that's a feature, not a bug, right? They're like, yeah, well, all the rest of that was bourgeois nonsense, and we don't need all these other interests at play. We don't need religions. We don't need all that stuff. We just need one authority. Well, I think that's what you and I both agree is the fundamental problem, is that when you have a monoculture and monopolitic, it could only go in bad directions. So the way to prevent that is to re-empower the cultural magisteria, first of all, as independent from politics. And that means that when I say I'm a left winger, we don't immediately assume I have a monoculture in mind. That the culture that you're like, if you're voting left and I'm voting left, we won't immediately say, well, of course we share this atheist, comrade, woke, social justice, set of biblical, almost like biblical principles, that like we're all going to follow this religion, this like woke religion.
Yeah.
Because that's what they're trying to do. That's what the people who are a part of this is they're trying to do, is they're saying, well, when Claudine Gay is put into office, we can trust her to do everything we want her to do because she's a true believer in the woke religion. And so basically all of her points, talking points, points of view, whatever, will be aligned to one particular position. And that any other person who we vet and any other position of power, this is what I think DEI really does, by the way. It vets people for their culture. And it's you can't get into power unless you accept.
I'd say wokeness more generally does that, right?
One moment, please.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so wokeness in general. Sorry about that. I'm back. So wokeness in general is exactly that. It is a sort of left-wing religion that jealously tries to remove any diversity cognitively. So when they say we believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion, they don't actually mean diversity. They do mean inclusion, but they don't even mean equity either, because equity is only equity for those people in the religion. So if you also join our religion, let's say we're talking about a
I'm
business.
not even sure that they mean inclusion because they'll exclude people who are who don't have the same
Religion.
views.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
DEI only works if you join the religion. In other words, just like the Communist Party, it's only equal and only inclusive for those people who fully agree with us. Like once they're in the party, then yes, we are diverse, equitable, and equal and inclusive. But until you actually join the party, no, like we won't include you. We don't accept your brand of diversity or your version of equality. And so, if you are a classical liberal, your idea of equality is equal individuality, which is I honor your individual uniqueness, subjectivity, your rights, your privilege. I honor all that.
Hmm.
And that's a form of equity. But that's not the form of equity that they consider is acceptable. So, in other words, they have a religious principle about what kind of equity we're talking about. And you get the point. So, the idea is that
Hmm.
when you have that sort of monoculture and it insists on itself that basically you have to join our culture before you can be considered equal or diverse or included, well, then that is absolutely a dangerous scenario. And so to fix that, you have to force the separation between culture and politics. Because as long as politics is so much more powerful than culture, then every left wing political movement will need to have its culture married to its politic. It will always be like that until you actually give culture an independent power. And so, as long as you're a Marxist or anything that follows from Marxism, you can't have independent culture from politics. They won't allow it. But if you are a moderate, like a classical liberal, or even just a classical moderate, a welfare state moderate, um, uh, um, uh, um, a mixed market capitalist of the 1950s and 60s, before all this
Hmm.
started, um, you would still believe that someone's cultural values could greatly differ from the political secularism that is the standard, right? Because
Yeah.
secularism is not a religion.
So yeah, then you could still have like a society that is built on like common values, but also has a values pluralism to it, built on top of like maybe a two level consequentialist or preference utilitarian with a minimal but solid deontology and a mature virtue ethics that blends all these things, and a jurisprudence that is always, at least instrumentally, um, moving towards the good, however you want to define that,
There you got
right?
it. And you I that references the call I did with Jim Rutt recently, a couple months ago, the Jim Rutt episode where I talk about
Well, I haven't actually heard that.
it's,
That was actually just me, as far as I know.
it's funny. It's funny because what you just said. So when on that episode, I talk about the 7 basic ethical positions, and I mentioned deontology, virtue ethics, and so forth. And what I argue is that it's like a bell curve where
Yeah.
you have most of decisions can be lying in the center left and center right. If you're a moderate, you can focus on that. If you're a radical, you end up into these extreme ethical positions. And at the center right is virtue ethics, and at the center left is pragmatism. Okay. And they are things that can work well with a secular society and with pluralist, complex landscapes and so forth. But they don't work well with radical systems because virtue from Aristotle was about balance. It was all about balancing the various virtues and understanding how to weigh things in proportion in a complex society. And pragmatism looks at what works. And so they're willing to be somewhat objective about tools to solve problems. But once you get outside of the center of the bell curve and get to the radical tails, you're getting into authoritarian systems that are very so like if you're in the far right, um, it's might makes right, that basically the strong should rule, and the strong should make the rules, and that means they become the elite, and they can basically rig the system in their values and against their enemies. And then on the far left, you have might makes right for the collective, as opposed to
Hmm.
the cadre. Now, in practice, it ends up looking similar to the far right, but they at least claim that they're only seizing power for the collective rather than for the elite clique. Um,
Yeah, and that kind of goes into like the concept of like the horseshoe, right?
yeah,
Like once you go too far one way, you're basically the same thing, right? Political horseshoe. I mean, there's other models than that too, but
right,
that's the
right. And from an ethical
yeah.
perspective, it's because the outcomes of the far left and the far right ethical systems are practically similar. That when you try to put them into place, the far left ends up creating an elite cadre, a vanguard party, and they ended up biasing everything into their favor, their interests. So the far left usually results in a true two-tier system, which is like the inner party and then everybody else, just like Orwell described in 1984. Um,
Hmm.
and so, like, that's why the far left needs to constantly be reminded of George Orwell, because he described it as well as anyone could, to say you have this inner party, and they will, no matter what, the outer party will never have full access to the information. They'll always be living in a propaganda system. Um, and be careful what you wish for, because if you want a DEI type of society, you also are going to be subject to the DEI czars, that they're going to have the
Hmm.
full authority over what counts as true, and they could change
Yeah.
it on their whim, and you have no authority to do with anything about it.
Hmm.
Um, but anyway, yeah. But so the center right is built on virtue ethics, and the center left is built on pragmatism. Well, as I said before, the center left is science foundation, where historically we'd say whatever science has demonstrated to be true, we're going to kind of calibrate our opinions around that. That's the center left. Whereas the center right, they use ethical judgment from well vetted ethical leaders. So they believe that there are some people, such as Supreme Court justices, who are so well trained in ethics that they can do a good job at running the court system. And so that one's tricky, but I will say that ultimately you need people to make decisions. You can't just have AI or the scientific community to decide everything. And so where the center right becomes useful is you say, well, we have certain trusted or vetted leaders that have good ethics and they know how to use them. And if we don't believe that that's possible, then the entire judicial system is bullshit, right?
Yeah,
You
I
can't have
think we
a
have an
judicial system without it.
issue. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we also have an issue of having too much of like a managerial class of like bureaucrats and like the judicial system and the administrative system kind of collude, and there's no proper like uh and legislative, like there's no proper separation of powers anymore. They're all like tied together in some weird way. It feels. Um, do you feel that way as well, or?
I feel that as long as we let political structures be the dominant structure, that's going to be the case, because political structures do not believe in objectivity or that it's a good thing. No matter what political party you've ever encountered in the real world, not in a theoretical discussion or conjecture, in the real world, all political parties are inherently biased, and happily so, because they're fighting over power, not over truth. And many analysts have come to the same conclusion that you can never trust a political authority to actually uphold truth as a higher value. It will always hold its ideologies as higher than truth. Um,
Hmm.
and that because that's how it coalesces power, is because basically human beings are hard to wrangle, and so politicians have to buy people. And once you have to start buying people, you can no longer trust objective truth because
Yeah.
you have to spin everything. You can't have any straight answers. So anyway, the point is that Supreme Court justices are all partisan because they're selected by politicians.
Hmm.
So one of my bones to pick with that is I think it's entirely easy to come up with a judiciary that is selected by only judges and lawyers, if they pick their own. Um, that there are ways to do that, such as like you could have um, a national body of lawyers and justices, and you can have a few volunteers from every state sit on it, and that they would actually determine the nominations for the Supreme Court. Although you could have the final pick, I guess, go through Congress or something. I don't know, but if we still want to do that. But basically, you could easily have the judicial system be selected independently. And we know that's possible because there are some cultures and civilizations who have done that, where they promote their judiciary was allowed to build its own power structure independently of Congress. Um, so again, most of the answers I'm going to give you keep returning to the same theme, which is checks and balances is the best historical tool that we have for resolving ethical dilemmas in institutional structure. And so, if we are suffering from a really bad bias in our society, we immediately have to revisit that and say the distribution of power here is skewed. It's off, and we need to create a new check and balance on this. And that's pretty much how modern democracies became heavily bureaucratized. So the the problem, this solution also creates its own problem. And so, do I think we're ever going to come to any ultimate solutions here for humanity? No, because again, every new solution we create introduces new problems, unintended consequences. And that's part of complex systems, is that we're trying to take a real inherently complex world and make it merely complicated. And I don't know if you know um, complexity math enough to know what that means, to know what I'm saying by that.
Not super well, but I'm familiar with like systems thinking and complexity science as a concept. I'm not like deeply well versed. I'm not formally educated in it or anything like that, but I understand the basic concepts. I think
Yeah.
to the best of my ability.
Well, all human institutions are dealing with complex problems that are not truly fully controllable when we're at macro scale or social scale. Um, that's pretty cool when you think about it. It means that the environment and human systems are so complex that we don't have to worry about any one authority fully controlling us ever. Because even when they try to, they're doing it simply by violence. But as we always say, is like if you're a Russian, you can always be free in your mind, even if you aren't free in your body, right? But um, so there are limits to authority, to authoritarian control and power, because like when the Russians want to try to control the economy, they found out it didn't really work that well, and they had some famines. So all they could really control was who starved to death, right? So
Hmm.
they said, well, we can't prevent famine, but we can make sure the Ukrainians die before the Russians. And that's what they did, by the way. So that's proof what happens when you take a complex economy and you try to control it, is that there's certain things you just can't control. And as history moves forward, we try to control more of those things. What we do is we build systems, and those systems make what is truly complex merely complicated. And a simple example of that is to say, let's manage traffic in a city. So let's put up traffic lights and we'll put up traffic routes or whatever. And we'll try to set up certain incentives to spread the traffic out and to make it all smooth and improve the ability to people to get on where they're going on time. No matter what you do, there's some effects in that are like the stock market. They're a random walk. So you can keep putting more and more controls on traffic, and it'll just simply displace the volatility into some edge condition. So let's say everything works great unless the power lights go out, and then we have total chaos. Or everything works great unless we have a dignitary like Donald Trump coming in and he's going to be giving a talk, and next thing you know, everything's backed up an hour. So they can't solve every problem, but we pretend that we do because it's good enough to get things done on a day-to-day basis. And a complicated system has many, many parts, and they all kind of fit together, but they're never truly complex. And so
Hmm.
in social organization, we try to turn complex systems into complicated ones with many parts. But
Yeah, basically the difference between like a clock and like a, I don't know, like an
yes,
ant colony.
yes. The classic
Yeah.
example is that a clock is a complicated system. It's what we call hierarchically decomposed, which means that a complicated system is fully decomposable. It means
Yeah.
that you can take a whole problem and break it down into its parts without creating new problems, right?
Hmm.
So classic mechanical engineering works like this, where it's like, all right, we want to do this thing. Let's just break it down into systems and subsystems, and we're going to solve sub problems, and we're going to it all fits together as a general solution. And that works as long as things are complicated but not complex. But if the problem is truly complex, then it means it's not fully hierarchically decomposable. It means that there's some uh, um, effects that sort of loop back. They don't necessarily work neatly and cleanly by level or type. So you tried to say that, well, um, as we're trying to break a problem into its parts, some of these subparts actually recursively affect each other in weird ways. And so when we're trying to control it, it creates new problems. And
Hmm.
that's how most social systems and environmental systems work. Is that
Hmm.
even if we think we have a really good solution for 99.9% of things, we can actually create new crises just by trying to solve it. Right.
Yeah. So I think I'm gonna wrap up soon, but before I do you want to touch on the Olympic stuff, or do you want to do that in another conversation sometime, or like, is there anything else you want to say before you go about your work or anything like that?
So I'll hit on the Olympics thing as a really good way to end our conversation because it really does tie everything we've been saying in together. Um, uh, I come from a point of view of ethics that I'm an author of. My co-author on that, Barry Mitnick, was the guy I told you who was the head of my dissertation committee, who was social
Hmm.
issues and management. And we wrote a paper back in 2012 about the commitment to action. And what we said is that um, people have prior commitments. Whenever they're going to make a particular decision, they don't walk in there as a blank slate. Not only are we talking about their beliefs, we're talking about their actual commitments to take action on other principles. So, for example, are you going to vote in the general election? Are you going to vote for Kamala Harris? Well, once you analyze someone's prior commitments, you can see how it can obstruct their decision making. Because you'd say, well, I'm actually already committed to make sure that Harris wins the election. So if anyone brings up a talking point that I think might help Trump or might hurt Harris, I have to be dishonest about it. I have to automatically bias the answer How dare you bring that up? We need Harris to win, right? So if you bring up a talking point that sounds even remotely conservative, they're going to scream at you, shout you down, and not even hear you. So this is my whole point of view, is that every marginal decision that a human has to make is already obstructed by their prior commitments to take actions on certain issues. And that if you want to form a new commitment, like if I'm going to betray that, then I have to form a new commitment to a new action. And that's very risky, right? So if I were to say, hey, let's say, uh, um, I'm a Christian. Okay, the Olympics opening ceremony, and we have imagery that we think offends Christians because it looks like they're using values that mock our values in their portrayals of like the Last Supper. They're doing things that wouldn't be, they would be Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Orgies,
Hmm.
like Christians aren't supposed to support orgies and that kind of thing. Um, but you're pretty damn sure you saw a Last Supper followed by an orgy, right? Or at
Hmm.
least the idea that orgies are a good thing. You feel like you're being mocked. And so you have prior commitments to Christianity, which are very strong. This means you're going to notice anything that might offend you. You're you're not going to pay attention to all the messy details about, is this Bacchus or Dionysus? Is this which kind of drag queen is this? What all those are all these messy details that are not culturally interesting to you. The only thing you care about is, boom, Last Supper. I saw that. It looks like Jesus. Is it offensive or positive? Looks bad. Don't like it. Immediately, conservatives are going to jump on it, and that means they're not going to even listen to the facts until they've gotten their they've protected their cultural identity, right? On the other hand, you have the opposite on the other side, which is to say they're going to want to protect their own interests, and it should be obvious, right? And that means neither side is really willing to hear. They don't really care about the objective truth. They only care about the blowback and the response and who won. That's all they really care about. They have no commitment to truth here. It's not important. And so, if somebody like me comes up and says, let's analyze this critically, um, that only opens up a risk that you're wrong. Why would they bother?
Hmm.
If they simply go with their talking points and they stick with their political or cultural identity, then they don't need to hear objective things that might interfere with their strength or their power. That's only a risk. Why would they do that?
Hmm.
And same thing with the other side. However, for those of us who actually want to see the culture wars go away, we want to see power shifted. They are correct. We do want to take power away from the political debate. We do want to take um, the edge off of
And give it back to culture and science.
right, and we want to do it by separating culture, by letting people have more of a cultural identity separate from politics. So you could be a progressive Christian and be allowed to say that this bothered you and yet also vote for Kamala,
Hmm.
right? That's a better world, right? That's more freedom, it's
For
more
sure.
power, it's more individuality. You get to assert yourself without being told there's only two options. So I
Hmm.
like that because it promotes more freedom of culture. And secondly, as you just pointed out, it also strengthens science and says we are going to resolve this with science. And I'm sorry, if Kamala's people happen to be wrong, how are we benefited from that? Because
Hmm.
she had, like, I'll leave you with this one. Bernie Sanders had a political platform in 2020 that was quite radical and looked very similar to the French platform. And remember, I told you we already saw what happened when the French came in power and tried to implement their socialist ideals, and then all the money left. Okay. So we had just seen that exact platform in place in France and fail. And then in 2020, Bernie Sanders comes up with a repeat of the French platform with many of the same taxes and many of the same ideas. about wealth taxes and punishing the rich and so forth. And they were very, very strong punishments of the rich. Okay. So when I saw that, I was like, well, this can't work. So because I have enough objective information to know it's not likely to work if he were to win, I can no longer support it or endorse it, even though I wish it worked. I wish it did, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm in a difficult bind here. So in 2020, people asked me, why are you backing down from supporting Bernie Sanders? I said, because we have definitive evidence his platform doesn't work. So the reason why that is important now is that the left wing can continue to shoot themselves in the foot by promoting things now that don't work and that will eventually empower the right, because when they try it and it fails, it's going to only embolden the right.
Yeah, I think that's particularly true of like the concern with wokeness. The thing I liked about Bernie is at least in his first time running, he never really was like appealing to that much, and even I think like I think you mentioned this in like one of your talks is that like they Hillary's campaign or something to do in culture basically made him out to be just some old white guy you have to hate because he wasn't on that woke stuff, and that's why BLM kind of came and pulled him off stage or tried to that one time because he wasn't speaking all the woke talking points, even though he was radical left on many issues, and he probably had their best interests in line and had a good civil rights record and all that stuff. And he was talking about universal issues like healthcare and education and stuff that affects everyone. Just because he didn't pander enough to the woke, I think is at least in part, not the only reason, but at least in part why he never went further in the race.
Yeah. So
So.
the Clintons are smart on another level compared to Sanders. Okay. Uh, they, how do I put it? They had a formal education as good as it gets, um, in terms of politics, and they were Rhodes Scholars. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they had, when you're a Rhodes Scholar, you basically have the keys to the kingdom academically. It's one of the
Mm-hmm.
highest honors you can possibly have. And these are people who are educated at the very top, and so they know what works and what doesn't work. They have those kinds of brains. Where
Mm-hmm.
the evil politician comes out in Hillary is when she spins everything, when she actually has a separate set of opinions than what she tells you. That's where it gets dangerous. Where it's like, I'm going to say one and do a thing and do another. But when the Clintons were in power before Sanders tried to run in 2016, they had already tried a lot of socialist policies that they couldn't get passed. They supported universal health care. They supported a lot of stuff, and they tried to find ways to make it work. And they learned the hard way about why you can't get there from here in American politics, at least not overnight. Um, so
Mm-hmm.
the reason why they were trying to make uh, Sanders look ridiculous was because they wanted him to drum up the base, but then they wanted to prove that he was ultimately non-viable. But they wanted to do it in a way that would not make them look like that they are enemies of the left. That they, in other words, that the Clintons are not truly, like fake left. So they came up with this idea of trying to plant him as a dinosaur culturally, to be like, well, he may have all the right ideas, but he's living in the 1940s. And so once we catch him on not understanding woke language and terminology, we can prove that he's too old to play in the sandbox. And by
Mm-hmm.
Hillary proving that she could use the lingo successfully, and also the fact that she had all the political connections in the South, especially with the black politicians of the South, it was hers to lose from her point of view because she already won the woke competition before he even jumped in. And so that way she could support a much more centrist, militarist, hawkish, pro-capitalist, pro-Wall Street ideology simply by peppering in woke to say, you know what, we're going to have corporate woke. So what we're going to do is instead of redistribute wealth, we're going to simply
Hmm.
promote people like Claudine Gay into positions of power. That was the Hillary Clinton solution. They cut a deal with the left, the Democrats, to basically say we're not going to do economic socialism at grand scale. What we're going to do is cultural socialism. We're going to empower a new cultural wave, and we're going to let those people, bully and threaten anybody who stands in their way. And everybody who rose to power in universities, governments, and businesses in the last 10 years who had left wing affiliation all used woke tactics to do so. Now, did Hillary Clinton actually think that would work in the long run? I think she's smart enough to know that it's a fatally flawed approach, but she thought it would at least get things moving. And she was right. So the long story short is if you are progressively empathetic with the left, okay, as I am, that I generally do believe in progress more than I believe in a Luddite or Amish sort of, well, the world stopped in 1900 or 1800 and let's keep it there. I do want to support progress. But what I'm really concerned with is, do we really have to do it in evil ways? Like, do we have to do nasty things and lie and cheat, manipulate just to get things to move forward? It's just
Yeah,
really bad
we
taste in
definitely
everyone's
don't.
mouth.
And to the extent that there might be some useful fictions, the ones we're running on now aren't useful. They're just terrible fictions,
Agreed.
and they destroy people, and it's divisive ideology under the guise of like a uniting ideology, and it just wrecks everything. Anyway,
So let's
I
let's
think
cut it there because it's been
we
2:30.
cut it there. Yeah, it's
But I really enjoyed it. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I think that
yeah.
you let me really kind of get my position out there, which sometimes I struggle to have a chance to get people to hit the reset button and just say, "What is Robert really all about here?" And and you really helped me with that. So
Well, I'm glad I could do that for you, and I hope that this serves as a good um, source material for people who are curious about that. So
thank you.
I'm going to end the recording here, and then I'll say goodbye off air. Okay?
All right, let's talk again. I enjoyed it.